I would like to begin by thanking the President of this morning's session for his kind words. It's a great honor to speak under his presidency, and a great honor and a great pleasure to talk on this very important occasion. I'm not a specialist on El Greco. The most I can bring is the fresh and enthusiastic eye of ignorance. And what I want to do today is to pass the chronological history, rather briefly, rather summarily, of El Greco's works, and then to try and arrive at some general conclusions about his use of architecture, his attitude to architecture in painting. Other colleagues will enlarge this investigation, and I'll be followed by Professors Berces and Tessari, who will speak about El Greco as an architect, as a designing architect. I would like also, before starting, to thank the organizers, to thank the museum for its extreme hospitality here, to thank Letizia de Cos and Ana Moreno for their constant help and efforts to bring us all here, to make us comfortable. And above all, I would like to thank Fernando Marias for his long work on the figure of El Greco, for his fundamental researches, revealing the notes and annotations, together with Agustin Bustamante some years ago, and for his organization of this occasion, and for his work on the exhibition and the catalogue, which I've had the good fortune to have sent to me in the form of a PDF. Extremely useful is his introduction. Extremely useful is the mass of new ideas, of information, of judgment, which one finds in that splendid catalogue. And I look forward to seeing the exhibition later on tomorrow. So, after these few words of thanks, inadequate in relation to the occasion, in relation to the efforts of Fernando Marias and his working group, I'll come back to the painted architecture of El Greco. I'm showing three images, 3 points, Byzantine reminiscences in the top left, extracted from the Modena triptych, one of the works in which El Greco most clearly shows his interest and knowledge of architecture in Venice, and then one of the little emergencies of architecture, unfortunately extremely rare in his work in Spain and Toledo, to which I'll come back later. I counted the number of works exhibited, the 50 works exhibited in the fine exhibition of Paolo Veronese now at the National Gallery, where there are present 50 works. How many of those works have architecture in them? 36 of 50 works have architecture, and that makes a total of 72%. I haven't attempted a similar statistical analysis because of difficulties of defining what architecture is in El Greco's paintings, but I think it'll be under 20%, around about 18-19%, a huge difference. What are the reasons for the difference between the presence of architecture in the works of El Greco and of Veronese? This, I think, is going to be a fundamental question in the course of this paper. Veronese had different sorts of commissions from El Greco. He had to paint huge public spaces. He had to paint the inside of two villas, the Villa Soranzo and Mazer. He had exceedingly learned patrons. He was entrusted with works of enormous importance, public works and religious works, had to devise compositions for suppers and banquets in refectories which could measure over 10 meters wide. And he filled these spaces magnificently with figures, with scenes, with architecture, demonstrating that he was really a film director when film didn't exist anymore. El Greco didn't have commissions of this sort and never developed, as he might have developed if he'd been asked to decorate a room in the Palazzo Ducale in Venice, this sort of theatrical performance in paint, which so distinguishes Veronese, as in his famous painting of the scene of Alexander and the family of Darius. These paintings, one could say, recall that phrase of Ben Jonson in the early 17th century, speaking of the masks at court, which he and Inigo Jones devised together. He writes, shows, mighty shows, these stupendous spectacles of poetry, of costume, and of architectural scenes. This is not the world of El Greco. El Greco, however, as we know, is a surprising figure in that while in Spain architecture almost disappears from his paintings or becomes nebulous, cloudy forms, merely indicating a sort of visionary, ephemeral architecture. He himself is a great expert on architecture, scholar of architecture, and a designer of altarpieces and other small architectural works. We've seen how El Greco has an extraordinary career, extraordinary to us, perhaps much less extraordinary to men of the 16th century, moving from Crete to Venice to Rome to Spain and settling in Toledo. The 16th century, in all aspects of its culture, its art, its painting, is a century of constant movement of the great protagonists and at the same time of constant change. Even if someone stayed in Italy, moving between Rome, Florence, Venice, Genoa, they always had to take account that within 10 years, the character of culture, the character of literary language, the character of architecture, and the visual arts was being very, very rapidly transformed. An important phrase which one finds in the life by Manetti of Brunelleschi takes us back to the origins of this constant renovation, change in architecture, when Manetti talks about the works which have disappeared by Brunelleschi in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And he says, when he designed these, he didn't have the style, he used the word modo, which he then developed. So, great architects, great artists, sometimes lived through several periods. And the fact that in the case of El Greco, this involved movement is, one could say, secondary. Here we are with the Domitian of the Virgin at the beginning of what we know of his career. On the left, I'm showing a painting by Georgios Klontras, which indicates what El Greco might have done if he stayed in Crete. One can see that the local style is there being invaded by architectural forms of an Italianate type. But in the painting in Syros, there's a reminder that architecture forms an integral part of the art of the painters in the Byzantine tradition. In this case, in the painting in Syros, the architecture is sort of props, small-scale props, suggesting fine buildings rather than a total delineation of such buildings. In the Athens adoration of the Magi, one sees El Greco beginning to assimilate and insert Italian modes. There is a structure with two columns carrying a vault, which has a pierced circular opening like the Pantheon in the middle of it. And one can ask, and perhaps a greater search of engraved or woodcut material could get us closer to where this comes from, but one can make two suggestions. He may have seen some derivation of the famous Prevedari engraving of Bramante, where there is a circular opening in the vaults, or could have seen engravings or woodcuts of parts of the Roman bars or similar structures in which such openings appear. One can note that the main architectural structure serves in a rather Italianate way, in a Veronese-like way, though the forms are different, as an embellishment for the Virgin, a sort of throne. However, the columns are very stocky. They don't respond to any of the rules propagated by the example of Bramante or already for several decades by the books of Sebastiano Serlio. Moving to the modern triptych, one finds an architectural scene as convention, iconographical convention necessitated of an indication of ruined structures. This relates to the legend, generally accepted legend, that at the moment of Christ's nativity, the vault of the Temple of Peace, for us the Basilica of Maxentius, collapsed. So one finds in Italian paintings almost invariably in scenes of the adoration some sort of Roman ruins. And Professor Navarrete, and I went quickly to the British Museum site yesterday, but this is his discovery, to find the woodcut of Brito after Titian, in which one sees the basis of El Greco's composition. It's particularly interesting to note that El Greco here is by no means a passive copier. In his small scale, in his small scale composition, he changes the fluted column into a simple pilaster, and then he makes another important change. A ruined arch is indicated here with its impost. He moves that impost from a point at the front of the composition to the rear of the composition. And I think this is a very important first indication of how El Greco uses material, published material, woodcuts, engravings, probably later on books, but not passively. He adjusts them to the composition, to the size of the work, and increasingly begins to understand how elements of this sort should function. If we look at the Annunciation, one can see for the first time in his work a feature that appears many times thereafter, a beautiful polychrome pavement, an Italianate piece of furniture on which the Virgin is leaning, and then a portal with a pediment. One can note that the pediment is a bit too steep. It should be lower. It's not correct from an architectural point of view, but one could say it's correct compositionally, that if it was lower, it would be less prominent, more insignificant, and wouldn't have that function within the composition. The scene of Sinai must, and here it'd be interesting to know the opinion of specialists on Cretan Byzantine painting. Not going forward here. The representation of the walled complex there, and one can see a modern photograph of it, conforms to a convention already established in late Roman antiquity. One sees it on coins and paintings of a view from above, essentially an axonometric view of a building or of a city. Very, very common in Roman coinage, and then which continues in Byzantine painting. So he's falling back there on the Byzantine tradition. Having difficulty in moving. So here we have a complete change. El Greco in Venice, or immediately post-Venice, one knows nothing about the precise dating, but his sources, his handling of them show close attention on his part to painting in Venice, above all the painting of Tintoretto. One can see perhaps an echo of earlier modes in the little detail I'm showing on the left, where one sees rather stocky columns in the portico carried on pedestals. One finds in Venice, in the Scuola di San Marco, for instance, columns on pedestals. These are rather low pedestals, like those in the atrium of Palazzo Farnese. I just mentioned that as a possibility, but easily he could have used that motif before seeing, as he went home in the evening, seeing the atrium of Palazzo Farnese. A view of this sort, a perspectival composition with a series of buildings that recede, with steps also in the foreground, is indebted in the first place to Sebastiano Serlio and his famous representation of the tragic scene. More directly and immediately, obviously, it's indebted to Tintoretto's compositions, these accelerated perspectives, which, like the Serlio scene, are closed by an arch, maybe an obelisk, as in this case, and also in Serlio, and with varied buildings along one or both sides of the composition. One can see other possible sources, and here I'd like to call attention to the engraving of Bramante, probably about 1500, with all'antica palaces, and to my eye it looks as if the use of arcades in the palace nearest to us and also the window with window edicules, that there is a knowledge, direct or indirect, one always has to say this, of that engraving of Bramante. Looking at the Dresden healing of the blind man, one can see this composition reworked perspectively with the presence of the steps, with the arch in the background. It is similar. The architecture, however, is reduced and is simplified in this really very small painting. However, once more, there is the presence of what appears to be the Bramante palace on the right in the engraving, which I'm putting back there. If one looks at the Parma painting, the architecture has transmuted and acquires some sort of Roman character. I want, excuse me, it's not clear to me whether the building on the left is a straight portico, I'd like to see it close up, or a round building, and therefore influenced in two respects by Raphael's cartoons or his tapestries, which he could easily, El Greco, have seen in Rome. Not only the round building, but also the steps. The steps which appear again and again in Tintoretto in the foreground, but also in these works of El Greco. Another parallel for a dominant position for a version of the Tempietto is the fine painting by Paolo Veronese in the museum in Rouen with a scene of San Barnaba, which is at present exhibited in the London exhibition. I imagine it'll go to the Verona version of the Veronese exhibition. The building on the left, behind Christ's head, seems to me it's a three-bay building with columns, freestanding columns, and a jutting entablature above them, and a rather large window. It has a Venetian character. It's not a Roman triumphal arch. It has a full upper story. And the building that seems to me closest to it that I can think of that you would certainly have seen is one half of the Scuola Grandi di San Rocco in Venice, which you see on the right. The other day, it was pointed out that the source, and I completely agree with this, obviously, for the building in the background is Gamucci's book on Roman antiquities, and the derivation from the woodcut is fairly certain because there's a very specific feature, these broken arches, which nail that identification. So maybe a work which was produced in Rome, or maybe he'd just seen the book, one can't say, which a very useful book, essential book really for someone who worked with books and read books. Passing to the theme of the expulsion of the merchants, I'd like to look at the two earlier versions of this. These are works of great interest from the architectural point of view. The scene is clearly indicated as being Venice by the buildings in the background. One can imagine that this was originally a composition made for Venetian clients. One has on the left a scene of either the portico or actually a part of the inside of the temple with an arch at the bottom and then with massive columns. If we just compare the two versions in a minute, we can see, however, that there are differences between them. The loggia, which appears in the background, is a standard device from Titian's presentation in the temple through into Tintoretto and Veronese, showing the Christ before Pilate of the Scuola di San Rocco of Tintoretto, a standard element at that place in an architectural perspectival composition in Venetian painting in the mid-16th century. Excuse the... So here we have the two versions, and the version which one can provisionally call the second version, the one on the right, is more coherent architecturally. There is a considerable ambiguity here as to what's happening with the columns. It's not explained as an architectural composition. Are the columns of the arch part of the system of columns on the inside of the building? It is not clear. And this one here, however, it's much clearer. One has square columns or piers with capitals, and then a simple arch. There are no columns towards us, and one has two full columns on the left. One sees there too very clearly the indication of the scene as Venice. Here are two details. The Venetian scene, Venetian campanile, a rather Veronese-like round building, however, inserted. And I'd like to speculate as to the sources of the building we see on the left. If one manipulates the shutters of the Church of San Sebastiano, Veronese, one can see that there's a rather similar building, a sort of Roman atrium or peristyle, small peristyle, with a straight entablature, Corinthian columns, and an arch. Note the arch at the end of the space. However, there are other possible sources. One should note the use of arches and columns, arches at the end of column porticos at the Palazzo Chiericati, the Rotunda, and so on by Palladio. To put an arch and a column may already, if El Greco is beginning to read architectural books, may be a theoretical statement about the two ways of covering a space in ancient architecture, as described by Alberti. That's the Palazzo Tieni, Bonin Longari by Palladio in Piazza Castello in Vicenza. One can note the similarity to the screen between the main chapel and the choir in the Church of San Giorgio, with two freestanding columns and then pilaster piers at the side. One can also note that the whole space resembles the portico of Octavia. Note the arch at the end, the columns at the side. I'm showing the structure well preserved today and Palladio's accurate reconstruction of it. Palladio is already on the scene by the time one comes to the expulsion of the merchants. El Greco is already familiar with his work and with the principles lying behind it. Unfortunately, this gentleman, I don't think, can possibly be Palladio, as it's been suggested. He is an intellectual artist. He has a lapis or chalk holder beneath, very discreetly beneath that thick book. One doesn't know whether it's his own book or the book of somebody else. And at the time, on the whole, a portrait of an architect shows that it's an architect, like the wonderful portrait in Denver of Vincenzo Scamozzi, holding a wooden model, presumably wooden, of his idea of the Corinthian capital. When El Greco paints an artist or a sculptor, he shows what they do. And at this point, I just want to make a little digression in relation to interior settings, the interior in El Greco, which is a minor aspect of his work, but a very interesting one. What he shows together with the sitter. In Dr. Park's presentation, it was extremely interesting to note what was hidden to the left of Vincenzo Anastagi, and if that was a pedestal carrying a column with a column base, it shows that El Greco decided to break with the Venetian convention when an important person, or even a saint, is the sitter, of inserting a completely unrealistic pedestal and column by them, just as Daniele Barbaro, painted by Veronese, has a column base, and a pedestal. That's not inappropriate for him, given his architectural studies and the fact that he has the two manuscript volumes of his translation and commentary on Vitruvius on the table in front of him. In one painting of a saint, not a portrait, of St. Paul, one can see a reminiscence, I think, of the Raphael school, Giulio Romano, interiors in the background of scenes of the Holy Family and so on, but also an attention both to the architectural language in the Veneto in the 60s and early 70s. I hope you're able to see the stairs in Tintoretto's Birth of the Baptist in the background there. At the Palazzo Portocolleone, a splendid building of the late 15th century, there's a small mid-16th century addition, the stairs here, which are extraordinarily similar to the ones. I'm not saying that he went to Tiene, that would be extremely improbable, but stairs of that sort were actually common in the Veneto in the 16th century. The grays, the view through a door to another door, all that, I think, must come out of the observation of Raphael's school interiors, or engravings, more likely engravings after them. When he wants, he can furnish a elaborate setting for somebody painted, as in the case of this portrait of San Ildefonso in Washington, or of a real person. Note again the pavement, the sort of pavement that begins with the Annunciation in his work, the Annunciation in Modena. Throughout, from his arrival in Venice, throughout El Greco's career, there are many traces in his painted work, as well as obviously in his notes on the Barbara Vitruvius, of his knowledge and interest in architecture. Fernando Marias noted in this painting of the Virgin the sudden visionary appearance of Palladio in the little tempietto one sees there, which, as Fernando Marias pointed out, is one of the two twin temples published by Palladio in the four books, the temples at Pola, and the plate with the elevation, the source there I'm showing on in the middle, obviously. It is enormously to the credit of Fernando Marias and of Professor Berches that they have studied, and Professor Berches marvelously documented in photographs, which I'm using here, the architectural works associated with El Greco in Toledo. And in these works, one can see that not only as an affirmation that Palladio was the best architect, but also the priority given to Palladio by El Greco as the model to follow in real architecture rather than in painted architecture. And one sees in this combination of the beautiful frame, usually gilded, with paintings which are extremely innovative with respect to earlier 16th century Italian traditions, where architecture belongs in the final decades of El Greco's career. It doesn't belong in the painting itself. The painting has its architecture, has its massing, has its structure, but it is not dependent for the definition of its composition, for establishing the role between people, like in Titian or in Veronese, of the Madonna on the high throne and the donors at the bottom. Purely figural motifs and the architecture of clouds do that work. But the paintings need a frame, and that frame is essentially, as architecture, a Palladian frame. We are thinking at the Palladio Center now for 2016 of organizing an exhibition to celebrate Scamozzi's, the centenary of Scamozzi's death in 1616, an exhibition with a provisional title of Palladio's Children. And I think among these children, there ought to be El Greco. And like Scamozzi, like Inigo Jones, El Greco truly understands Palladio. He understands the importance in Palladio's work of a highly selected vocabulary, of fixed rules, of a grammar, but also for the admirer and imitator of Palladio, the need not to imitate exactly, not to photocopy, but, as Palladio encourages his readers to do, to invent, to vary, provided you stay within a basic series of rules and principles. So one finds in these works not copies of Palladio, but someone who's designing freely, intelligently, inventively, in a Palladian manner. Just an example of this, an altar frame with a Tintoretto altarpiece in the Church of the Redentori, which, because of the date, El Greco probably could only know through drawings. The altar frame from Santo Domingo, and then the frame, very similar frame with fluted columns again, in a late work of Palladio in the Valmarana Chapel in Vicenza. And in spirit, a composition like the huge main altar on the right is close to late works of Palladio, like the scene of the Olimpico, and on the left I'm showing the huge, enormous monument to the Doge Alvisi Mocenigo, who died in 1577, where the central portion is emphasized by using columns. The two the two little bays with pilasters are a later addition. They don't belong to the Palladio composition. One can note also the use of statues above the pedestals, something, of course, that one finds in Herrera, one finds at the Escurial, but also in Palladio, who places in his book, often places in his reconstructions of ancient buildings and in his villa designs, statues which are, to our eye, excessively tall on the top of pediments. I'm coming towards the end here. Even the idea of inserting an element with or without a pediment, there was no room for a pediment on the title page of the 4 books, is something which must have been approved by Palladio. I don't know of any case where he uses in a built work, but he must have approved that title page, if not actually designed it, as I think is probable. The interest of Palladio in turning the corners of buildings, Palazzo Chiericati, Palazzo Barbaran da Porto, in this case, by combining columns and half columns, offers again an interesting parallel with Il Greco. One can see here and there that El Greco is absolutely familiar with Italian conventions, the stage set conventions behind the Virgin and the Annunciating Angel. One sees a scene that could be a sketch of the Teatro Olimpico. Small architectural emergencies appear. Here, St. Augustine carries a beautiful little tempietto, a very original, interesting design. And in the Crosier held by Sant'Ildefonso is again a little tempietto. A Palladian type of door, as painted by Veronese but used by Palladio, emerges in the Visitation with its mensole, and El Greco's concern with measurement precision appears in one of the secure drawings, which has lines drawn across it, carefully measuring the distance. So we've seen a career in which precise architecture in the Venetian paintings is replaced by another sort of architecture. Already in the version of the earlier expulsion, one can see that the column of the triumphal arch is beginning to become uncertain, more like drapes, more like not very much like there. More like the niche, which seems to be made of fabric. In the London catalogue of 2003, these are described as pilasters and columns, but I don't think one can appropriately describe the form. It's a drape that assumes an architectural form, just as clouds assume an architectural form. Here and there, all'antica elements are used, but simplified, as in the sarcophagus of the Resurrection, Giulio Romano, the Montelucci Madonna. And here we have that nebulous architecture, which is in keeping with the figures, the flickering light on the figures, which is not an architecture made of marble or brick. It's a visionary architecture, willfully visionary architecture by someone who knew all about brick and marble architecture. And I'm ending with this comparison, 2 different pictorial worlds by 2 great experts on architecture, Paolo Veronese's Adoration and an adoration by El Greco. The contrast between the architectures, the desire on the part of Paolo Veronese to underline his command of the architecture of Palladio and of antiquity, and El Greco's decision to leave the precise architecture, the scientific, artistic architecture of Palladio to the frame, and instead to invent an architectural world in keeping with his extraordinary figural style. Thank you.